This is a space where the intellect and the expertise gets a front row, and the subjects that we're talking about and really just pointing towards are so alive and so complex, and they do not live just in the mind. So thanks for taking a breath and arriving with me. So where do we begin? This is such a bigger conversation than we can have in 30 minutes. It's almost impossible to do this, but we're going to give it our best. So each of you has not only worked on issues of human rights violations, trauma and ecological disaster, these huge topics, but you've really lived through them personally, and I'd love to start with the deep personal. Danny, maybe starting with you. Can you locate us in your experience and the post-crisis that you navigated, and what emerged as something more life-giving as a way of organizing and healing?
Thanks, Azita, and thank you for the opportunity to be here to have this conversation with everyone in the room. So if it's okay, I'm not going to skip right to after, but actually to before. So what's known as the Black Summer Fires actually started at the end of winter. Winter in Australia is August 2019. And in September 2019, the Gondwana rainforests in the north of the state where I live burnt for the first time ever. These rainforests had never burnt before. And I have a very distinct memory of when they burnt. I was standing, as I was always doing during that time, with the radio next to me, and I heard that they burnt, and it hit me like a truck because I live in a rainforest and I had felt protected by living in a rainforest. And at that moment, I realised that climate catastrophe is not something that happens to someone else, somewhere else, at some time else, but it was happening to us here, now. And those rainforests hold a really great significance for Australians. Gondwana land is the name of the continent, the great continent that Australia came from, and so that was really a body blow for a lot of us. And then by January, Chris Dickman, one of my colleagues, had begun to do the count on the number of animals who were killed. And in January, he estimated that 1 billion wild animals had been killed. And it's easy to think that that is something that we regret, but again, what we experienced was this sense of really the core of what makes life valuable, that these fires that our forms of life had caused were now undermining the capacity of the earth to support any of us. And the emergency services, which were completely overrun, were absolutely focused on humans and human property and on individual human households. But what was happening at the community level was absolutely extraordinary, and I'm going to just tell a very concrete story that 2 women called a meeting in one of the local towns, in one of the pubs, of people who wanted to come together to support wildlife whose habitats had been completely destroyed. And 500 people came to that first meeting, and within a couple of weeks, there were literally thousands of people gathering food, building feeding and watering stations, putting them out, monitoring them. And then other women, and it was women doing this work, were organising networks of care to rescue animals and to care for the people who were caring for the animals. So this circle of multi-species care that was happening. And as people did this work in the face of the most extraordinary trauma, because we actually didn't know when the fires were going to end. There was no sense that this was coming to an end. It wasn't a finite catastrophe. And I want to acknowledge that there are people in the room who are going to be experiencing some re-traumatisation from what I'm saying, because I know other people have lived through this. But as people did this work, and we had the good fortune to interview and do workshops with a lot of people who were involved in this community care, there were some things that we learnt that really stood out to me that were new to me. The first thing, which I'd already alluded to, was that it wasn't that there was human injury and then more than human injury. We live as multi-species ecological communities, and so people experience the trauma as a single ecological trauma. The second was that as people got involved in collective work of care for each other, for ecosystems that had been destroyed, for other animals, there was a sense of possibility that grew in people, that the work of care wasn't something outward-facing, it was again this circle of regeneration. And the third was that it wasn't the people caring for the environment or for other animals as objects. It was a reciprocal relationship. So, for example, as people were doing regenerative work, and it's something Cesar referred to this morning of what happens after a fire, that you have these pockets of regeneration, that as people did that work, again, the ecology and the other animals were participating in some form of resistance, organising and healing that we were doing together. And you know, I know Jack's going to talk about his path of learning, and we'll get back to this, but what became evident to me in this work is that it's not about human rights organisation or social organisation and then ecological organisation on the one hand. It's this much more holistic, mutualistic, reciprocal form of organising resistance and healing together.
Thank you. I'm going to name little threads that come alive for me, and we don't have to go into each one, but I'm going to name them as they go along. One of the things that you're also speaking to is how modernity and the temporal pace of the agreements we've made of how fast we live often, and we'll speak to this with Jack as well, they get radically interrupted. And when there's a radical interruption, actually then that is when we see the time open up, oddly, and for some of this to happen. Jack, can you reflect on your journey?
Hi, thanks for having me here. So I'm a psychologist and have been working in the human rights field and with Danny on a number of projects. And I work in the area of collective trauma. And one of the collective traumas that I had personally experienced was 9/11, which took place a few blocks south of here. And I was basically, my children, 8 and 5 at the time, were going to the school 2 blocks north of the World Trade Center. So they, along with the 600 kids in that school, and there were a number of schools in Lower Manhattan, but they saw the people falling and jumping from the towers, and they had to be evacuated, and then we had to run from the debris storms. And then the schools were displaced, and many people were displaced from their homes as well. And so I had just come back from Kosovo, where I'd been that year working with the Department of Health, well, the psychiatry department, to help set up their mental health system, which didn't exist. It was an apartheid system in Kosovo, so the Kosovo Albanians did not have a health and mental health system, and there were 20 psychiatrists for 2 million people. And so they decided that they wanted to build a mental health system that was based on strengthening the resilience of Kosovar families and communities as part of the way of helping people deal with the impact of these wars. And so we were working on this project to promote this resilience in collective resilience, basically. And so I thought this sounds like this would be a good way of working with the communities here in New York that were affected by 9/11, since this was a collective trauma, which means that it wasn't just individual trauma or PTSD reactions. It means that there's collective trauma is about the unraveling of the social fabric. relationships are disrupted. People can start to feel like there's a loss of belonging. And, and that experience is very distressing for people. It's different from individual trauma. And so the goal is to engage in these communal processes which reconnect people and give people ways of coming together and addressing the needs that they see are most relevant. And our whole mental health system here is oriented toward coming in and bringing in counselors and professionals, very expert-oriented, and yet community members have tremendous capacity. They're not passive. They're starting to be creative and developing innovative approaches to addressing the changes that are going on and the needs for rebuilding or addressing their own stress reactions and kind of helping children. And so people in the community were already engaging in these kind of processes. And we started to have these community forums to talk about how we as a community could promote a kind of well-being process. Now, this was also an environmental disaster. These were fires burning for months. The environment was very toxic at the time. There was some attention to the toxicity from the government, but our community did not trust the government to give us the correct information. And we saw local people hiring environmental monitors to give us an accurate reading about the air quality, because we were being rushed down by our Mayor Giuliani back into the financial district, people, back to financial district, back to
time.
Buying things,
Back to time.
To get back into, buying things commercially, and then moving all the families back that had left the area because it was toxic. And now we know that many people have became very ill because of the exposure to this toxicity. I think probably more people have died from the illnesses than from the number of people who were killed in the towers in New York. So at the time, so there was some attention to the fact that this was an environmental disaster as well, but our focus was really more on building community. How could we strengthen our collective resilience to deal with this and really be the arbiters of our recovery? And we decided to go to FEMA and say, give communities here funding, not just outside clinicians, where 90% of the funding had been going to do PTSD interventions. And most people did not have PTSD. There were all kinds of other psychosocial issues that they were dealing with. And I think having worked in the global mental health field, I knew that there was this disconnection between what people really needed in communities after disaster and what the Western biomedical approach to disasters imagines people need. And so we were resisting that. And, basically we ended up promoting a number of activities that were, I think, very helpful for the community. I think one of the most important was supporting parents to help their kids, rather than just having kids screened for problems and then referred to therapists. So we brought parents together and basically facilitated discussions among them about what they recognized in their kids, what they saw was working, what do they need extra help with. And this was an incredibly powerful intervention. This is a collective resilience intervention. And I think that the kids in this school did better than almost any school in the whole state because of this collaboration that actually was being practiced which rarely gets practiced in the school system. Parents working together with teachers and working with the school staff to help kids. So another thing that the community did was to create a number of arts projects that tell the story about the community's experience. There was a theater project that was developed to interview people about their experience and then create a play that was performed in a theater in Lower Manhattan. And that became a space for people to come and then be able to talk about their own experience. So it was a collective gathering space. So basically, when you support communities to be able to address collective trauma, you can get all kinds of creative innovations. And I just will finish with this, the issue of how do you promote these islands of resilience. We heard earlier that in the process of kind of rehabilitation of a natural system, but also a social urban system, you'll see pockets of resilience starting to pop up. We saw Janine. We all saw Janine Benius, the biomimicry person, last year, and I thought, oh, this is really interesting for
the islands of fertility.
These islands of fertility. This is a good metaphor for what happens after a disaster too.
And what I'm really hearing also, Jack, thank you, that you're both really pointing towards is what is the architecture of reality that we're unconsciously or consciously participating in, and that much of this architecture is not relational architecture. And so even if some of this just feels so intuitive and obvious, like it's unbelievable to me that these are things that we're trying to point towards, but it's because everything else that we kind of, the underpinning, invisible and visible architectures don't allow for that relationality. Can you reflect on what you think, Danny, is emerging right now in terms of this socio-ecological paradigm?
So I'm the daughter of I come from a long medical tradition, even though I'm not a medical doctor. And so I often think like you have to have the right diagnosis in order to be able to think about what the intervention needs to be. And the term polycrisis is bandied around a lot at the moment, and people often think that it's just a name for multiple crises happening at the same time. But I think that term is trying to do a lot more. It's trying to talk about the complex, non-linear interactions. And probably because the relationship between ecological unravelling, refugee flows, authoritarianism and so on is just so in our faces right now, we're starting to see that this idea that there are human systems and then there are non-human systems and they exist in two different spheres is just an absolute, it's not an illusion, it's a constructed illusion. But of course it's always been so, right? The term ecocide was used for the first time in 1971 to talk about the use of Agent Orange to destroy the soil and the plant system that was the basis of human life for Southeast Asian communities. So now here it is in our face, and this is what I think you were pointing to, Azita, that we have to understand that this is the heart of the problem, right? That this unravelling of relationships is the symptom of an age-old separation, hyper-separation of Western dominant modernity, where, you know, what happens for humans is in one sphere and what happens for the environment, as if it's some type of background for us to be the protagonist on, happens in another sphere. And, you know, I'm really grateful to the team that they're actually bringing the Human Rights Conference and the More Than Human Rights Conference together. The truth is, though, that we as justice movements, we also exist in this toxic ecosystem of separation, right? We have human rights activists and then we have environmental activists. There is no difference between the breakdown of human rights and the breakdown of the environment. They are happening together. The unravelling is it's not, even to say it's interactive is the wrong metaphor, because it sounds as if there's something happening somewhere else that's influencing something happening over here. It's a single set of unravelings that are happening together. And if that is the case, then, and I'll use this phrase again, the organising, the resistance and the healing also have to happen together. And that's where I'm seeing the most exciting interventions. And some of it is incredibly simple. You know, we're all so trained to be so complex. Things like urban forests, right? Urban reforestation, where disenfranchised communities who have been alienated from food systems, who live in food deserts but also architectural deserts, are involved in community gardens, rebuilding urban forests, which are good for birds, good for trees, good for soil, good for our mental health, good for our physical health, good for community building. So those type of projects that are, to go back to what Jack said about reweaving, if you are reweaving the social fabric, these projects are reweaving the socio-ecological fabric. And if dominant Western modernity unravelled that fabric, then as I see it, the work of our movements has to be reweaving that fabric.
Thank you. A thread to pull on there a little bit is also that separation. I was just thinking about how when a fire burns or there's a natural disaster, who's the perpetrator? Is it the community that's affected? Is the perpetrator the fire itself? But hurt people. So when nature is causing harm, or as humans cause harms to other communities, what are the ways in which we react or respond? And I feel like there's definitely threads there that how we react and respond to the harm caused, quote unquote, to us in a natural disaster or in a fire or whatever, says a lot about how we relate to pain, too. What about you, Jack? What do you see as emerging in this space that's worth pointing to?
One of the most hopeful things I've seen is working with UCLA's Department of Ecological Medicine. They're creating a field there now that integrates human health with ecological health. And it's a very exciting number of, many different multidisciplinary connections are being made, from relationships to animals, relationships to gardening, but the essential principle of this center is to integrate more of this, our health. Our health is inseparable from the health of the ecology, from the planet. So how do we think about health promotion in that sense? And what happened after this this center was started was that the LA fires happened in Los Angeles. And so one of the first things they did was to form a collective recovery project. And so they asked me and a number of other people who had worked after 9/11 here and also after Hurricane Katrina to come advise on how do you set up a collective recovery project. And it's been modeled very much around what we were doing in supporting communities to be the arbiters of their recovery. And so you now have all of these spontaneous community developments around the LA area. These islands of resilience have popped up. People just have been creatively addressing different needs, but they're also implementing something that I was going to talk about here with the 9/11 project. We had something called New York City Recovers, which was a way of bringing together organizations across the region, because an environmental disaster like 9/11 was a regional disaster, and it affected communities all over. There were 100,000 people that came in every day to the neighborhood of the World Trade Center, this vertical neighborhood, basically, and those relationships were kind of lost. And these make up the kind of framework of a city to have these kind of soft relationships. So what are you going to do to replace these relationships? So we had this project that brought together these community organizations from all around the region to talk about what they were seeing, what the needs were, share information, and then work on how to address some of the issues, the ongoing grief and feelings people were having during the years after that disaster. So this, what we call strengthening the mesosystem, which is how do you link together these islands of resilience, is a very important part of promoting this collective recovery process. And this is what they're doing in LA now. They have ongoing meetings every 2 weeks with all of the mental health providers, many of them, and these community organizations. And they're really creating this kind of meso structure that mediates between the government and funders and policymakers and the people at the grassroots level. So it's basically it's a bottom-up driven process, but it connects to the top, and then it's mediated by this meso level. And so they're because they had this eco-medicine approach, they immediately started to look at how they were going to integrate communal healing with ecological reconstruction. So much of the focus has started to look at, how is rebuilding going to take place, and how is that going to be coordinated with promoting well-being in the populations that have been affected. But this is just getting started, but it's a very hopeful sign about how this is being now integrated. Yeah, these are not separate realms anymore.
Yeah. I don't even, we talked about collective healing. Is there a such thing as individual healing?
I don't see how they're. The
myth,
the individual is a myth, right? We're never individual. As someone said to me a little while ago, you could cut off my arm and I could survive, but if you cut off my water and my air, I wouldn't survive. Yeah. So we're always dependent on each other, on the earth, on earth others. And just as we unravel together, we ravel together. I don't think that's a word, but we ravel. Well, maybe it could be a word. We ravel together. So I think what's really beautiful in what Jack's saying is we learn through praxis, right? And it's these praxis of collective care and collective regeneration that are also feeding our minds of the way to do this differently.
So knowing these pathways undeniably work, they're undeniably life-giving, what is the impediment and what is in the way of these frameworks and models actually taking root in more places?
Institutions and our notions of the way that the world works are very sticky. And they're sticky not just because we get attached to our ways of making sense, which we do, and human exceptionalism and human supremacism is such a dominant ideology that we have been born into. But look at the way our institutions structure, our educational institutions, our funding institutions, our organisations of justice. So I think all of those, they just make it hard work. You're told that you're interdisciplinary or you're intersectorial when you're actually just working with the way that the world works. So I think those are impediments. That's probably all I want to say. I'll let Jack.
Well, in my field, it's kind of the way medicine has been organized scientifically, and I think that we're now seeing that we need to integrate indigenous knowledge and other forms of knowledge in the way we think about healing. And this collective resilience approach is practiced by every indigenous community. This idea that healing is not about individual healing. It's about being in right relationship with each other and with our environment, with the whole ecology, and we see this. It was very nice that this eco-medicine program started because they put their psychedelic medicine research program into it, so that it put it into a sociocultural context, and it has indigenous advisors on the project. And I think it's one way of pushing back against the pharma industry, trying to take over the psychedelic medicine field. But the thing that I've been hearing from many of the researchers on psychedelic medicine now is that we realize it's not the medicine that is the healing part. It's coming together and being in harmony with each other and the environment. That's what these medicines help you get to, but it's that social effervescence that is actually what is healing. I think that this is really an important part. We really need to take that seriously. And there are many ways to get people to this harmonization process, not just psychedelic medicine. There's a lot of other
Definitely
technologies of what we call technologies of synchronization, like dancing and drumming and all kinds of forms of expression and ecstatic.
And an expansion of
healing.
what we consider technology. This is where language is so flat and does not serve us in many ways right now. And the words, there's so many words, and there's so much, quote unquote, the ick word of content. But it's really hard to know where to locate oneself with just the deluge of overwhelm of what we're all facing. So in the spirit of collective vitality, I wonder if we should open it up to the space and see if there's any other voices in the room that feel particularly alive to offer anything.
Say your name and just tell them a little bit about you. Yes, I'm Natasha. I'm from Georgetown. I built human rights databases for the last 5 years. I think what really stood out to me is how you spoke about when the fires broke out. Like it's this moment, right, that it won't happen to me, but it does happen to you. In Nepal, for us, that was the earthquake. And for me, I really try to think about how we can build resilience and acts of collective care preemptively, because a lot of what you all spoke about was in reaction or in response to things, right? Which I think is obviously critical, but maybe a question for you would be is how can we build those same frameworks in a way that we can already be responsive to when things do happen, we can rapidly put those in place. So whether that's a rapid response sort of nexus we create, mental health tools we already give people, but would love to hear more about it.
Azita, shall I take one more? Sure. Yeah. Another? Okay.
Hi, I'm Amelia. I am really interested in the way you've been talking about collective care as a like you said, as a response to specific traumas or specific disasters, where in my work, I'm thinking a lot about the need for constant collective care. The collective care of our communities writ large, the communities that we identify in, but also like this community in this room and amongst human rights defenders and practitioners. There's such a ongoing need for us to think about the collective versus the individual. Thank you.
And we've got one more over here. Tom.
Thanks. Thank you very much for that. On a similar note to the first question, that story about the fires in Australia was very moving, and it reminded me of something that Amitav Ghosh said about these disasters being the earth intervening to revise those habits of thought based on a Cartesian dualism that sees man as separate from nature. So I think what strikes me, and I think COVID was a very similar experience, and I think what strikes me is that these are things that arise from feeling rather than thought, and so I would sort of ask in the similar vein to the first question about the role of arts and particularly film in sort of inciting that response in people, and particularly young people, whose imaginations are more malleable and potentially receptive to that shift that once is realized is always there. Thanks.
Thank you. I want to lift up a word that's coming to me through all three of your questions, which is, what do we value? The word value. The actions we take preemptively, or anything that we invest in resource, money, time, love, care in, has to be something that's pulling us forward because we collectively value it. And if value is being back to the tension of time and the reductive quality of how we spend our time right now to earn towards the system, makes it really hard to know, how do we steer, where's the off-ramp?
I would actually use a word that is probably verboten in spaces like NYU.
Do it, Danny.
What do we love? What do we love?
So, now, lost my train of
What do
thought.
we love?
That word.
What do we love?
What do we love?
Yeah.
The question about, shouldn't we be practicing collective care without having to do it after a disaster? I think that's a great question. And it reminds me of Rebecca Solnit's book, what is it, Paradise Built from Hell? That in disasters, you recover this sense of interdependence that is a part of us. And it brings out this way of this collective care in a way that we, as if it's gone. It's in our bodies. We remember it. It's part of our biological evolutionary heritage to get together with other groups like this. But it's, and you see it, after disaster. You saw in New York, people practicing interdependence. It was really wild for a few weeks, New Yorkers being so nice to each other, and so there is a kind of hormonal experience of oxytocin, I think, coming out, and people bonding because that's adaptive in a crisis. But we were wondering whether this is actually what's there all the time, and it's just our institutions prevent us from having this kind of connectedness, because they quickly get us to go back into our separate ways of doing things, our over-individualized perspectives, and it becomes very tiring to actually work upstream against that. Because I thought that we were very energized by the process of recovery after New York, and we would have probably continued if we didn't have to deal with all these institutions getting in our way. So I think, there is something natural that we can be tapping into and that we should be accessing all the time to promote this collective process of care and care and love.
And just to quickly touch on the point of the artists, our friend Saul is here, who started Quiet with the leading question of what is the artist's role in society. And back to reductive value, it's everyone's an artist, and we actually deeply need our creative spirit and our spiritual practices that are invoked through creativity to translate and sense make and live in the spaces that are in the in-between. And I believe only the arts can do that, and only creativity can do that. So I'm so glad you lifted that up. Johanna, how are we doing on time?
We have another minute or two if you'd like.
Well, Danny, any closing feelings, thoughts, words, prayers?
Well, I wanted to... I mean, Jack answered that question so beautifully. I just wanted to add one thought to it, which, as Jack said, so many of us have had that experience of what it is to be in relations of care in the context of disaster, and then we snap back because institutions are invested in separation, in monetizing care, and in instrumental forms of behaviour, and in being in a hurry. And I think it's something that Saul said when he was speaking the other day, that to gather in spaces of care and non-instrumental action like making art is a revolutionary act. And it is a revolutionary act because colonialism and capitalism and patriarchy, and I'm sorry to use a bunch of big words like that, but they have structured the world so that care is devalued, so that non-instrumental activity like making art, unless it's for a commercial market, is devalued. And when Jack was talking about eco-medicine, I was thinking one of the dangers is that this again gets instrumentalized. And so resisting instrumentalization and actually seeing that this work of rebuilding the fabric or reweaving the fabric of our lives is not just in order to protect us against disaster. It's for the sake of living a life that is worth living. It's for the sake of being able to be in good relationship with Earth others so that we can all function and flourish. It's for the sake of that.
Thank you both, and thank you for the level of sobriety and emotional courage and continue to press your bodies against some of the hardest things, the darkest things, and bringing so much beauty and insight and tenderness out of it. And thank you, everyone, for being here today.
Thank you, Azita. Thank you.